On a freezing winter morning in Moscow, the roar of engines shattered the still sky. Russia's presidential jet, an Il-96 usually reserved for global superpowers, was seen descending flanked by two MiG-29 fighter jets in flawless formation. But it was not landing in Paris, Washington, or Beijing. It was bound for Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso. On the tarmac, a red carpet was already rolled out and soldiers stood stiff, almost in disbelief. Cameras from international broadcasters snapped into place. CNN even broke into regular programming to ask a question that rippled across the globe. Why would the Kremlin grant such an honor to a young African officer barely 35 years old, Captain Ibrahim Traoré? For the next 48 hours, the world held its breath. There were no press conferences, no official agendas, no speeches, only silence. Yet satellites tracked a mysterious convoy moving through restricted Russian facilities. French officials demanded answers. American analysts raised alarms. Commentators whispered about new weapons deals, secret pacts, and looming shifts in West Africa's fragile balance of power. But when the truth emerged, it was not about rockets or tanks. It was about something far more dangerous to the old order knowledge. This was not a routine diplomatic visit. It was a signal that the story of Africa is shifting. A country long dismissed as peripheral was suddenly at the very center of NATO briefings, African street markets, and global speculation. And at the heart of it all stood a young soldier who refused to follow the script. So here's the real question. Was this 48-hour silence the beginning of Africa's military alignment, or was it the blueprint for a new kind of independence? If you believe that the awakening of Africa deserves to be told with truth, not just headlines, stay with us until the very end of this story. Please share if you feel you are among the first to support President Ibrahim Traoré. And subscribe if you believe the truth matters more than the noise. The day the Russian presidential jet touched down in Ouagadougou, history seemed to bend. Burkina Faso, a landlocked nation often overlooked in world affairs, was suddenly thrust into the spotlight of global geopolitics. The red carpet was not ceremonial fluff. The MiG-29 escort was not routine. These were gestures normally reserved for visits of presidents with nuclear codes or economies that move global markets. And yet, the man walking toward the Russian aircraft was Captain Ibrahim Traoré, a soldier of just 35 years, leading a nation whose GDP represents less than 1% of world trade. International newsrooms reacted in real time. CNN cut into scheduled programming anchors leaning forward with urgency. Why Russia's presidential plane for Burkina Faso? One asked as graphics rolled across the bottom of the screen. In Brussels, NATO analysts flagged the incident as symbolic and unprecedented. French newspapers splashed headlines demanding clarification from the Kremlin. And in Ouagadougou itself, Burkinabe soldiers stood frozen, their disbelief captured in countless photographs as Traoré advanced with calm precision toward the jet. But what followed confused even seasoned observers. For 48 hours, nothing official emerged. No joint statements, no televised parades, no press briefings. The silence was deafening, and it fueled suspicion. Was this a covert military pact? A secret deal to supply missiles or drones? Western intelligence agencies scrambled to interpret satellite imagery showing convoys moving from Moscow toward restricted facilities. Something unusual was happening, but no one could yet say what. Then came the first leak. A short, grainy clip circulated online, apparently filmed inside a Russian drone development hangar. The figure in the video wore boots and heavy gloves. He walked beside Russian engineers, not inspecting missile warheads, but pointing toward battery cells, solar panels, and wing designs optimized for desert conditions. The figure was Captain Ibrahim Traoré. Observers were stunned. This was not the posture of a buyer negotiating weapons contracts. This was the posture of a student, a leader absorbing knowledge. As rumors swirled, local radios in Ouagadougou asked the same piercing question: what did Traoré intend to bring home? Gold oil concessions, military guarantees. Yet whispers told another story. Reports suggested he had declined standard weapons packages and instead requested access to open-source schematics for water harvesting, renewable energy grids, and low-cost drones for agricultural mapping. The headlines abroad spoke of security threats, but inside Burkina Faso, the discussion turned to survival. Could these blueprints really help villages facing drought blackouts and crumbling schools? French officials were alarmed. For decades, Paris had maintained its influence in West Africa through loans, infrastructure contracts, and military assistance. If a nation like Burkina Faso could begin to replicate advanced systems without French approval, the very foundation of that relationship would weaken. American analysts echoed the concern in closed briefings. One remarked bluntly, if they succeed in replicating these technologies, the old tools of leverage, sanctions, loans, dependency become meaningless. Yet, despite the alarms, there was still no evidence of weapons transfers, no footage of Traore standing beside tanks, no announcements of new defense agreements. The silence itself became the message. What was absent mattered more than what was visible. The lack of military spectacle suggested something deeper was at play, and then the story began to turn. When fragments of additional footage surfaced, they showed Traore in laboratories, not armories. He observed prototypes of off-grid energy cores, water purification kits, and agricultural drones. Western commentators expected missiles. What they got were blueprints for survival. For the people of Burkina Faso, this shift carried profound symbolism. Their leader was not begging for protection or pleading for aid. He was demanding tools, knowledge systems that could be replicated, adapted, and owned by Burkinabe hands. The spectacle of fighter jets and red carpets had given way to something far more practical, the quiet dignity of self-reliance. In those 48 hours of silence, a narrative was rewritten. The world expected an arms deal. Instead, what emerged was the image of a young African leader choosing blueprints over bullets. And with that choice, Ibrahim Traoré transformed not only the expectations of foreign powers, but also the imagination of his own people. The climax of the story did not unfold with a declaration or a parade. It began with an image, a grainy cell phone video taken at Ouagadougou's airport as the Russian presidential jet returned. Before Captain Ibrahim Traoré stepped onto the tarmac, another figure emerged carrying a plain black briefcase. No insignia, no diplomatic crest, no visible locks. Yet security officers allowed it to pass without inspection. Within minutes, speculation exploded. Was this cash? Classified agreements? Secret weapon codes? For days, whispers dominated both African markets and Western intelligence briefings. But then the truth surfaced not through leaks from embassies, but through village schools. Teachers began unrolling cloth charts labeled in French and Maori, showing step-by-step diagrams of how to assemble off-grid solar grids, build low-cost water pumps, and erect modular classrooms resistant to dust storms. Blueprints spread from community centers to radio call-ins to workshops where women were learning how to maintain solar lamps and purify water. The briefcase was not a vault of weapons. It was a library of survival. That revelation flipped the narrative on its head. Western capitals had braced for a new military pact, perhaps the birth of another Russia-backed alliance. Instead, they were confronted with something far harder to contain: knowledge. As one NATO analyst admitted in a closed briefing, we can counter weapons with weapons. But how do you counter a blueprint that can be photocopied, redrawn in chalk, and applied in any village? The international reactions came fast and sharp. In Paris, policymakers were furious. For decades, France had maintained its grip over West Africa, not only through the CFA franc, but also by controlling infrastructure loans. If Burkina Faso could build water systems, schools, and power grids without those loans, French influence would erode overnight. Envoys scrambled to offer new research partnerships, but their proposals rang hollow against the reality that Burkinabe villagers were already building with their own hands. In Brussels, NATO's concern shifted from fighter escorts to the deeper implications. Internal reports flagged the development of decentralized energy and water systems as strategic threats, warning that they could reduce Europe's ability to leverage aid. What alarmed them was not immediate instability, but the precedent, a nation rewriting dependency into resilience. In Washington, the mood was conflicted. Intelligence assessments confirmed no evidence of weapons transfers. One report even noted with concern that Burkina Faso's emphasis on solar grids and water harvesting aligns with U.S. post-war models of community resilience. Some advisors argued the United States should pivot, offering technical cooperation rather than aid packages. Others insisted that if left unchecked, Traoré's model could inspire other African nations to walk away from Western assistance altogether. But the most electric reactions did not come from foreign ministries. They came from African streets. In Mali, Niger, and Chad, radio stations replayed clips of Traore walking through Russian facilities. On social media, captions spread like wildfire. He went for tools, not toys. Young Africans weary of foreign lectures about democracy saw in Traore's silence a louder message that dignity could be engineered at home, not imported from abroad. This was the real turning point. The West had expected tanks, treaties, and threats. What they got instead was a young leader demanding knowledge, a briefcase filled with survival blueprints, and the symbolism of a country standing on its own. For Burkina Faso citizens, it was a message more powerful than any military parade. Their leader had not returned with promises of protection, but with tools to make independence real in daily life. That inversion, choosing blueprints over bullets, was the moment the world realized the ground had shifted. The old game of aid and dependency was cracking not with violence, but with quiet replication. And in that realization lay both the unease of the powerful and the hope of the powerless. The true weight of Traore's Moscow visit was not measured on diplomatic cables or military briefings. It was measured in the dust of Burkina Faso villages where survival had long been treated as an afterthought by the global order. Within weeks of his return, small but profound changes began to ripple through daily life. In the northern provinces, teachers no longer waited for imported textbooks that often arrived years late. Instead, they introduced new logic charts printed on cloth, teaching children the basics of coding with chalk and paper. These were not symbolic gestures. They were practical steps toward literacy in a digital age adapted to classrooms without electricity. In the drought-stricken East, farmers began experimenting with improvised drones assembled from recycled batteries and scrap metal. Guided by diagrams traced from the mysterious briefcase, these rudimentary machines scanned soil for moisture, allowing farmers to conserve water in ways that had previously seemed impossible. For families who had lived at the mercy of erratic rains, the promise of precision agriculture felt revolutionary. Women, often burdened most heavily by poverty, were among the first to feel the shift. In community centers in Ouagadougou and Bobo-Dioulasso, mothers learned to repair low-voltage batteries and maintain solar lamps. Girls who had once spent hours walking for firewood now sat in training sessions on water filtration. Teenage daughters who had never touched a computer practiced coding sequences drawn in chalk on blackboards. Each act was small, but together they formed a mosaic of empowerment. These quiet revolutions created a challenge for Burkina Faso's own government. Ministries accustomed to slow-moving procedures suddenly found themselves outpaced by local initiative. At one late-night cabinet meeting, officials debated whether to integrate these off-grid projects into the national budget or allow them to remain parallel. The dilemma was clear: if citizens could already build for themselves, what role should the state play? For a nation scarred by 8 coups since independence, this was no small question. Traore, however, reframed legitimacy itself. Instead of promising reforms, his administration pointed to prototypes: a water pump assembled for less than $3, a mesh network connecting villages without state telecom approval, a classroom lit entirely by recycled solar panels. These were not slogans. They were proof. Proof that survival could be engineered outside the old systems of aid and dependency. Proof that a leader's credibility could rest not on speeches, but on results. The political atmosphere inside Ouagadougou shifted quickly. Rallies no longer focused on ideology, but on delivery. How many schools had light? How many villages had irrigation? How many families had clean drinking water? For the first time in decades, politics was less about waiting for foreign donors and more about measuring progress in real numbers. Internationally, the consequences were impossible to ignore. France, which still dominated much of West Africa's financial system through the CFA franc, watched with frustration as loan offers were quietly rejected. The United States, though more cautious, acknowledged that Burkina Faso was setting a precedent modernization outside Western aid structures and even outside China's investment pipelines. And regionally, the effect was contagious. Delegations from Mali, Niger, and Chad arrived not with diplomats but with teachers and electricians eager to learn. What began as a 48-hour silence in Moscow was now a Sahel-wide experiment: independence through replication. In village after village, the evidence was clear. Dependency was dissolving, dignity was returning, and politics was being redefined not by armies or slogans, but by what ordinary people could build with their own hands. For many Americans watching from afar, the story of Captain Ibrahim Traoré struck an oddly familiar chord. When news anchors described a young African leader demanding blueprints instead of bullets, older viewers recalled their own history. After World War II, it was not grand speeches that rebuilt the United States. It was the GI Bill vocational training irrigation projects and the quiet dignity of veterans returning home with skills to build houses, farms, and universities. In rural America, where barns were raised by neighbors and dust fields were turned into breadbaskets through simple irrigation, the images of Burkina Faso children coding on chalkboards felt almost like echoes from another era. At U.S. military colleges, analysts studied the Moscow visit with unusual seriousness. Their assessment was blunt. Traore was waging peace like a campaign. The discipline was military satellite convoys, tight security, silent operations, but the objective was survival, water security, food security, energy independence. That framing resonated with American veterans and older audiences who believe true patriotism begins with fixing problems at home before debating them in parliaments. Inside Washington, however, the debate was more divided. Some policy experts argued the United States should embrace Traore's model, positioning itself as a coach rather than a creditor. They suggested programs of open-source technical support, agricultural fellowships, and teacher exchanges, forms of partnership rooted in America's own tradition of self-reliance. Others, more cautious, warned that such a pivot would mean conceding strategic ground. If Burkina Faso's approach spread, entire regions of Africa could drift beyond the reach of U.S. leverage, bypassing both Western aid structures and Chinese investment frameworks. Across the Atlantic, France faced a harsher reality. For decades, its influence in West Africa had rested on two pillars: the CFA franc and infrastructure loans. Both were suddenly under threat. When villages could power themselves, harvest their own water, and light classrooms with recycled solar grids, the appeal of Paris-backed loans shrank dramatically. French officials tried to reframe their offers as partnerships, but the ground had already shifted. In Brussels, energy executives admitted privately that decentralized solar and water systems, if scaled, would erode European-backed infrastructure markets. "It is not weapons we fear," one admitted, "it is the photocopy machine." The comment captured the essence of the dilemma: a blueprint once shared can be redrawn endlessly, immune to sanctions or embargoes. Meanwhile, Beijing observed carefully. China had invested heavily in African infrastructure, but Traore's approach carved a third path. It was neither Western loans nor Chinese megaprojects. It was do-it-yourself survival, locally owned and replicated. If this model spread, even Beijing's state-driven partnerships might face resistance from communities preferring independence. Globally, the symbolism could not be ignored. A briefcase filled with survival diagrams had proven more disruptive than any missile shipment. It revealed two hard truths. First, decentralized systems are nearly impossible to sanction or control. Second, ethical dignity lasts longer than dependency. In a continent where democracy has often been promised, but rarely delivered with stability, the quiet competence of local communities was harder to discredit. For American audiences, the ethical question was unavoidable. Should the U.S. resist this transformation, trying to reassert influence, or should it respect it, and perhaps rediscover in Traore's vision something deeply aligned with America's own values of self-reliance, education, and dignity? The answer remains uncertain, but one thing is clear. The world is no longer watching Africa as a passive recipient of aid. It is watching a blueprint unfold, one that could redefine the global order page by page, village by village. When Captain Ibrahim Traoré finally returned to Ouagadougou, there were no fireworks, no champagne receptions. Instead, there were barefoot children running toward classrooms lit by solar lamps they had helped assemble. Dust rose from unpaved roads as women gathered at new water pumps made from recycled parts. For a country long dismissed as fragile, these sights carried the weight of rebirth. And yet the story is not only about Burkina Faso. What began as 48 hours of silence in Moscow has become a blueprint that unsettles capitals from Paris to Washington, from Brussels to Beijing. The reason is simple: weapons can be tracked, loans can be negotiated, and treaties can be revoked, but a photocopied blueprint cannot be erased. Once survival skills are taught, they live on in every family, every classroom, every field. This is where the warning lies. For those who profit from dependency, the age of easy control is ending. The sanctions, the aid packages, the promises of development assistance, all of these lose power when communities learn to build for themselves. The balance of influence is shifting not through armies or coups, but through chalkboards, toolkits, and the dignity of self-reliance. That shift will not stop at Burkina Faso's borders. Already delegations from Mali, Niger, and Chad are sending teachers and electricians to observe. Tomorrow, it could be Senegal, Ghana, or even Kenya. For older Americans, watching the echo is unmistakable. It recalls the post-war years when veterans built homes, farms, and schools, not by waiting for permission, but by using their own hands. It speaks to a tradition of resilience that many fear America itself has forgotten. And it raises a deeper question. Will the United States stand against this transformation, clinging to outdated tools of leverage, or will it recognize in Traoré's vision something profoundly familiar, an insistence that dignity grows from work, not from dependency? The stakes are larger than one nation. They touch the future of Africa, the credibility of Western promises, and the possibility of a new global order where independence is measured not in military alliances, but in the ability of ordinary citizens to light their homes, irrigate their crops, and teach their children. So let me leave you with this. Do you think President Ibrahim Traoré's reform strategies are truly effective, yet can he be trusted to carry this blueprint forward, or should another rise to succeed him? If you believe Africa's awakening deserves to be told with truth, not just headlines, then share this story. Please subscribe if you agree that dignity, self-reliance, and survival matter more than propaganda. And above all, remember, once a people learn to build for themselves, no empire on earth can keep them from rising.